recording. Sorry, the first part was cut off. Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon is known for its hanging gardens, which was one of the wonders of the world. It's no longer in existence, although a lot of descriptions showcase it as being really amazing. It's also the supposed location of the Tower of Babel, which is what's pictured in the background. Brandon, do you remember what the Tower of Babel is, actually?
Yeah, so I mean, it was the tower created to reach the heavens.
Yes.
And God did not like it.
What is it actually?
Well,
starts with a Z, the vocab word, ziggurat.
Ziggurat.
Yes. So most people believe today that the Tower of Babel was a ziggurat. Do we have any remnants of it? No. Are there records of a large ziggurat being built that was higher than any other ziggurat before? Yes. Is the Tower of Babel story true? I don't know. But yes, so we're talking about that Babylon. This is the Babylon that most people, like I said, think of when they think of Babylon. But this is actually the second wave of Babylon. Babylon, or Neo-Babylon, was another example of a fortified city. So after the last people group we've talked about, the Assyrians, other people that took over followed suit and started creating fortified cities. They kind of learned that it was a good idea. So Neo-Babylon also was a fortified city. And at the front of their city, just like the Lamassu, they created something very impressive. They created the Ishtar Gates. This is a reconstruction which is located in Germany, if you want to see it in person. But bits and pieces were found, as well as written records of what it looked like. It was made of lapis lazuli, a very precious stone, and a lot of inlaid mythological creatures as well, including repetitive images of Marduk and Nabu's dragon and Abdad's bull. And yes, I had to write that there because there's no freaking way I would remember that. So we have repetitive images of a mythological bull owned by a god and a dragon over and over. So those functioned in the same way as Lamassu did, as basically guardian figures to protect the city. You would have these really massive, I think you can kind of see how large they are. Here's a little diagram. Most people only come up to about here on these gates in this reproduction. They're huge. So you'd see these huge, massive gates, which really showcase the wealth and power of Neo-Babylon. And then on them, you have these ferocious looking animals to try and deter you from ever trying to do harm to the citizens or to conquer the city.
I don't know, the fact that it's made of lapis, like, I think that would be more enticing to like
Seal it? Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
picture them.
Yeah. Babylon itself was all about trying to show off wealth and power, which is why we have the Tower of Babel, the Hanging Gardens, which was one of the wonders, which housed a lot of exotic plants in the desert. It was all about showing off wealth and money. So I think it carries over into those gates. Now, we aren't done yet. The Babylonians end up being conquered as well. So I'll move this screen so we can see. This is in around 575 BCE. Well, the Persians end up taking over pretty quickly after that. In the 6th century, the Persians formed the Achaemenid dynasty and end up expanding their empire all the way into, well, they tried to do Greece and Rome. It becomes the largest empire that the world had ever seen to that point, and it will remain the largest empire until Alexander the Great conquers them. And that happens around 330. So they last for about 200 years. This is the longest group we've talked about in this section. And they too learned from the Assyrians and the Babylonians. They created fortified cities. They also created really large palace complexes for their kings. And we are going to be looking at parts of Darius I and Xerxes palace complexes, starting with the columns from the Apodena or audience hall that are left behind. So we are not in ancient Greece, but we have columns. And these columns occur before the ancient Greeks make their columns. So the ancient Greeks, not the first to use columns. Are they more proficient at it? Yes. Not the first though. We're going to look at another culture in the Aegeans that also predate with columns, but they are new. Their columns are a little upside down. But we do have fluting. The fluting is adopted by the Greeks. Fluting is those ridges that are on the columns. And there's also a base on these, which you can't really see. The base is palm leaves. The Greeks tend to do a very plain base on their columns. And the capital on this is quite interesting. So the capital had animals on it. And the animals looked like they were lifting up or holding up the ceiling of this audience hall. So very different from any other columns that we're going to be looking at today, or not today, but in the future. There are 36 columns in total that would have held up the ceiling of this audience hall for this palace. And the columns themselves are about 67 feet tall. Of course, we only have fragments today. So these guys, rather than just showing off wealth, they wanted to show off the ability to create a palace complex and show off the artistry of the artisans that they had. That is partially because the Persians conquered so much land that they brought artisans back with them and wanted those foreign artisans to help decorate and design the motifs in the palace. So really showing off their conquests more so than their wealth. They would even have Greeks come and design things on occasion because they own parts of Greece. Another view of one of the palaces, just to give you an idea of the complex size. This is just a portion of it. But Darius I says in an inscription on one of the reliefs that we have that Ionian Greeks, Medes people, Egyptians, and Babylonian masons, architects, and artisans helped to build these complexes. So really bringing every conquered nation that they had, their ideal artisans together to make these intricate palace designs. Another symbol of Persian power can be seen here with this low relief processional frieze. This processional frieze would have been in the audience hall of the palace that we just looked at, the aerial view of. On this relief, you have citizens of different cultures, particularly here it's the Persian and Medes rulers, bringing offerings to the king. So they're having their conquered people come and bring them stuff. And they're illustrating it on a frieze that's going to be kept as a record to show off their power and their conquest. So Persian art's a little bit different from Babylonians or the other cultures that we've looked at because their art and architecture is all about trying to show off how large and vast their empire is. Of course, they are the largest empire that's happened on the planet, so it kind of makes sense that it would be them to do that versus like the Babylonians. And we can tell who's who by the traditional garb in case you're interested. As well as the items that they're carrying. The Persian nobles are wearing pleated skirts, and the Medes people are wearing short skirts, which is traditional for them. And this would have been painted. All of these friezes would have been painted originally. So the palace would have been adorned in jewel tones with really fancy columns and reliefs all over the place. But all things come to an end. Like I mentioned, Alexander the Great ends up conquering the Persian Empire, which I think is more common knowledge. But eventually Mesopotamia ends up becoming a province of the Greeks and Romans, which is what happens to a lot of areas. Egypt will eventually become a province of Rome after Cleopatra. And who ends up ruling Mesopotamia are the Sasanians. They claim to be direct descendants of the Achaemenid people, which we talked about earlier a while ago yesterday. So it's been a hot minute since we've talked about them. But the first Sasanian king is Shapur I, and he decided during his rule he was going to have a very impressive palace complex built using interesting architectural innovations. Particularly, he had a large arch built, huge arch, really, really big arch, as well as a Iwan. Iwans, we'll see a lot more when we get to Muslim architecture. They are large porches, which tend to be identical on each side. So on each side of this arch was an Iwan porch. And on those Iwans are blind arcades. Blind arcades are fake arches, which is what you see there. So those are all things that had not been done in architecture yet. Blind arcades, really impressively large arches, and Iwans. Those are new to architecture, and it starts with the Sasanian. Regular arches had been in existence. The Romans had already been doing that. But arches to this size are new. And the crazy mess that is Mesopotamia, because of all the people that keep conquering it, I promise none of the other peoples that we're going to be talking about do that. It gets really confusing. But eventually the Sasanian Empire ends up coming to an end as well and being conquered by the Arabs. We're not talking about that. We'll talk about that when we get to Muslim art and architecture, but that happens in 636 CE. And the Arabs end up becoming so impressed by Shapur I's palace that they adopt the Iwan porch format, as well as some other architectural features that he used. You might notice some of them, like blind art. And symmetry. Very, very much symmetry in Muslim architecture. But yeah, that wraps up Mesopotamia. Like I said, it was chaos because there's a lot happening throughout those years. The Egyptians, we don't have that. The Greeks, they get conquered once. So we don't have that either. Rome gets a little dicey because of all the people that keep getting assassinated. But yeah, it's not going to be nearly as confusing as this people group conquered this people group, and then this one, and this one, and that doesn't happen again. So I apologize for Mesopotamia's messy history, but I can't fix it. So in summary, the world gains a very large array of knowledge from the Mesopotamians, like writing, wheels, the pottery wheel is from them, thank you. And a lot of architectural motifs and features and ideas as well. Of course, they were not in their own little bubble. They traded with the people around them, including the Egyptians, which is what we're about to go into next. So we will see some motifs carried over into Egypt. But specifically, in what ways do you think the Mesopotamians might have influenced other cultures? Both back then and now, and it doesn't have to just be art.
Wealth.
Yeah, power and wealth, symbols, like illustrating those symbols of power and wealth. Yeah,
Power
yeah,
that's empire.
Definitely a big thing that ends up being adopted by a lot of other cultures. Even today, we still like to show off who's in power.
Yeah.
What else? Fortified cities, yes. What else?
And mobilizing like the leaders at the time, be it religious or like.
Yes, very good.
Yeah, a lot of mythology.
Mm-hmm.
So people are like the
Showing those
stories about-
mythological figures, yes, definitely. Anything else? Laws. Code of Hammurabi was the first set of written laws in history, so that's kind of a cool one. It all started with an eye for an eye. I don't know if that's where you want to start, but that's where it started. So we are going to see, like I said, a lot of this stuff carry over into what we're about to begin. Egypt. Egypt is split into 3 periods, which you kind of already found out from your quiz. There's an old kingdom, a middle kingdom, and a new kingdom. Also, there's the Amarna period thrown in there in the new kingdom era, which completely shakes things up. But we are primarily talking about Egypt under the pharaohs. There was an Egypt before pharaohs, but they were quite nomadic, and there's not much from them. So we're focusing on Egypt under the pharaohs. Where are we starting? At the Nile River. So the Nile River is extremely important in Egyptian culture, just like the Fertile Crescent was for Mesopotamia. If the Nile River didn't exist in Egypt, it would have just been a vast desert. And if you're familiar with civilizations, they tend to pop up along fertile areas with water. So that's exactly how Egypt began. Egypt was famous for its abundance, particularly abundance of food, and eventually people. First comes food, though. And that's all thanks to that Nile River. We are going to be talking about dynastic periods throughout this section, but those dynastic periods do vary. It depends on who you talk to and which historian you're looking at. I'm just going to use your books because I'm not going to delve into that. It's complex. And those of you that have taken my class before know I don't like numbers. So I'm not getting into dates. Do I list the dates? Yes. They are rough, vague dates, though. But as far as by dynastic periods, what I'm talking about is people argue when the Old, Middle, and New Kingdom actually start. There's rough ideas as to those breakdowns, but opinions change. And a lot of what we know about these people is thanks to the hieroglyphs that they left behind. And the only reason we can read those hieroglyphs is thanks to the Rosetta Stone, which was found by Napoleon. Yay! Originally, Egypt was divided into a Lower and Upper Egypt. Eventually, they were united under one guy. We'll talk about that guy later on. He is attributed with unification, but most historians do argue that unification took several hundred years. He was just the one that got accredited for it. Because it's not like overnight one person can just stop a war between 2 countries and make them one country. It took a lot of time for that to happen. He just happened to be the one in power when it finally happened. But yes, there's an Upper and Lower Egypt. They are not upper and lower, they are upper and lower. That is because the Nile flows this way. It's a little backwards. And fun fact, most of the Nile River doesn't even go through Egypt. Yeah.
No.
What do we need to know before we get started? Like I said, most of these are going to start off with a video to get us introduced with basic ideas, but for the Egyptians in particular, mythology is really important. The Greeks are also going to have a lot of mythology, so we'll get to watch a little mythology from them too. But in Egypt, mythology is really important, so we are going to watch a video to give us some insight into the main gods and goddesses. Do you need to remember every single one of their names? No. Will I be mentioning them multiple times? Yes. So let's go over what they did.
Hey there, I'm Mike Burdetta, and this is Crash Course Mythology. Today, we're going to start looking at pantheons. Pantheons are families of gods, and those families are complicated, really complicated. A whole tangle of grandparents and parents and uncles and aunts and nieces and nephews. They have amazing feasts, but honestly, can you imagine Thanksgiving dinner with these people? The pantheons we are going to examine are families of deities from cultures that are usually considered polytheistic, meaning that they worship more than one god. In most mythological traditions, the gods are seen as immortal, and according to David Leeming, they are personified projections of the human mythmaker's dreams of overcoming the inevitable effects of the physical laws that require death and disintegration. Yeah, we went dark pretty quick. In creation stories and other myths, God represents a creative force that brings and sustains life. The sun, the winds, impatience, love. Pantheons, David Leeming argues, help us to explain how and why the world we know came into being and can tell us a lot about a culture. Leeming writes, all pantheons are ontological and teleological. That is, they are metaphors for the human attempt to make sense of existence itself and to assign ultimate cause. To read a pantheon is to read a culture's sense of itself and of the nature of the cosmos.
And we are talking about a lot of pantheons in this class. Yeah.
Pantheons explain the naked mole rat. Let's find out together. If you thought I was going to start with the Greeks, gotcha. High five toe. The Egyptian pantheon. Right off the bat, I'm going to say that the Egyptian pantheon is even more confusing than your average confusing pantheon. First up, there's no standard version of the Egyptian pantheon. The myth changes depending upon who is writing it and where and when. For example, in the story of Isis and Osiris, our most complete source isn't even Egyptian. It's the Greek biographer Plutarch, who wrote in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, well after Egypt had become Hellenized and then Romanized. In his version of the Isis and Osiris myths, he gives Egyptian gods Greek names. For example, he refers to Thoth as Hermes. He does still give you credit for inventing darts, though. So there are also different versions of the.
So, yeah, as we go through, there's going to be different names for the same god. So the sun god in early Egypt is usually called Ra. Later on, he'll be called Amen. Sometimes he's called Amen-Ra, because that's helpful to us today. Yeah.
Pantheon, depending upon where you are in Egypt. For the most part, we'll be sticking with the group of gods worshipped at the city of Heliopolis and headed by Atum or Ra. But we'll give a nod to the fact that in Thebes, the pantheon was led by Amun. And we can't forget the attempted monotheism of Akhenaten. That was classic. And just to make this even trickier, a lot of the Egyptian sources we have for myths are fragmentary, and they're spread out over thousands of years. So for simplicity, we're going to settle on the 9-god pantheon that forms the core of Egyptian religious belief. And it doesn't include Thoth. Sorry, no. The Ennead, or 9 gods, was in place in Heliopolis by 2700 BCE and is the one found in the pyramid texts, which might be the oldest surviving set of religious texts in the world. At the top of this pantheon is Atum, aka Re, aka Ra, aka Khepri, aka Amun, or sometimes Amun-Ra, depending upon where in Egypt you are. This is why we're trying to simplify things. Atum is the great eye of the heavens and of creation. He was the spitter in our Egyptian creation story. Atum's creative Kaf creates Shu, the life spirit, and Tefnut, the world order or cosmos. This brother and sister pair give birth to Geb and Nut. Geb is the spirit of life, and Nut is an Egyptian great mother goddess. Brother and sister Geb and Nut become the mother and father of the rest of the gods in this pantheon. Their children, Osiris and Isis, are probably the best known Egyptian gods, other than Hakheb and Ra. Osiris, god of the underworld and grain, kind of like a Demeter/Hades combo, was probably the most popular of the Egyptian gods. Because I mean, hey, who doesn't like food and death? He dies and is revived, which happens more than you'd expect in death. Actually, maybe exactly as much as you'd expect in death. Isis is a goddess of the earth and the moon and is married to Osiris. The mystery cult of Isis was popular well beyond Egypt, into Roman times. And if you're not sure what a mystery cult is, guess what? That's the point. The second son and third child from the Geb-Nut pairing is Set. Set is a god of evil and darkness and is the nemesis of Isis and Osiris. He's married to his sister Nephthys, a goddess of death and dusk. Because, if you're going to be married for all of eternity, it's nice to share interests. And the final piece of this puzzle is young Horus, not to be confused with old Horus, or the guy from Warhammer. He has aspects of a sun god. He's a light that defeats Set's darkness. Most important though, Horus, who is often depicted with the head of a falcon, not a hawk, not an ibis, is the spiritual force behind the pharaohs. I know that you're wondering when we're going to talk about Anubis, Bastet, and Sekhmet, but remember, for the sake of comparative simplicity, we're sticking by this 9-god pantheon. So what conclusions then can we draw from this basic pantheon? There are multiple versions of sun gods, with Ra representing both the sun and creation, and Horus representing both the sun and kingship. So we can infer that the sun was important to the Egyptians, probably as much for its eternal cycle of death and rebirth as for its providing life-giving energy. Ancient Egyptian culture is commonly said to focus on death, and that's not wrong, although death to the Egyptians probably didn't hold the same terror that it does for many in the modern world. I think the most distinct...
So if you notice, there were like 3 gods and goddesses listed there that had to do with death and darkness. Which just shows you how important the afterlife is for the Egyptians. They have a bunch of sun gods and a bunch of death gods. Those are your 2 main amounts of multiple gods for them, which shows that those are probably the 2 most important things, sun being representative of life and growing things and goodness, and death being the afterlife for them. Which, like you said, for us today, death is not a positive thing, so it wouldn't seem right to have multiple death gods to us. But for them, it made sense, which leads us into predominantly what we're focusing on today, which is the celebration of life and death, which is what a lot of Egyptian art is about. We're starting off first with a celebration of life, unless this keeps playing. Particularly the life of King Narmer. But we will quickly go into death in a moment. So, if you take my art appreciation class, you've seen this before. This is not new to you. If you have not taken my art appreciation class, you might have seen these. This might be new to you. But this is Palette of Narmer. This is from the pre-dynastic period when the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt takes place. Narmer is the guy that's attributed with uniting the 2 because he happened to be in power. Was he the person that did all of the grunt work? No, but he gets credit. There are 2 sides to this palette. We're looking at the back side at the moment, on which we see Narmer himself in hierarchic scale. He is the largest figure on the palette, and he is conquering his adversary and being followed by his attendant, who is this very small person in the back. He is shown wearing the white crown of Lower Egypt on this side. On the opposite side, the front side of this palette, he's shown wearing the other crown. So he's shown wearing both the crown of Upper and the crown of Lower Egypt because he's the guy that unites the 2, which makes sense that he would wear both crowns, one on each side. He is being represented or guided by Horus over here, who is being shown with the falcon. Horus, remember, sun god, good guy. And there's some gods being represented up here as well. The goddess of life. You don't need to know her name unless you really want to know, and then you can figure it out, but you don't need to know. But yes, so this is the site of conquering. And this whole palette is celebrating Narmer's conquests during his life. This was made while he was alive. The opposite side, the front side, has a similar pattern. We have registers on this side. There are registers on this side too, but there's only 2 registers. This one has 3 registers. We have those same bull goddesses up at the top. But on this side, we see Narmer wearing the other crown, leading his soldiers into battle in a very unified manner. Over here are the conquered foes. Their heads have been removed and placed in between their legs, which was pretty standard for the time. On the second register, you see 2 lions with their heads, their necks look like serpent necks, and their heads are entwined. This would have held charcoal in the center used to help shield Egyptians' eyes on sunny days, like sunglasses. And down at the bottom, we have the scene of a bull knocking down a city wall, once again showing conquering. This is all about celebrating his conquests. He is known as uniting the two nations together. He's known for conquering. It's all about celebrating it. So what have we talked about so far for Mesopotamia that's kind of similar to this?
The city walls, I mean.
No.
As you know.
There's an actual artifact, a stele, actually, that is very similar to this. Anyone know the name of it? You can use your book, I don't care. You can use your book of notes, not gonna bug me. It's after the work of it. The Standard of Error kind of on the war side does that. It's the Victory Stele of Naram-Sin. They're almost identical. So Naram-Sin's Victory Stele shows Naram-Sin walking his troops into battle, conquering them. There's also hierarchic scale used in that Victory Stele, just like there is here, to show the importance of Narmer in this one. Both of them have to do with victory. So very, very similar stylistic choices. What else is similar stylistically? Well, it has to do with poses. What's happening with positioning here?
They're all in,
Composite and profile view, yeah, exactly. So that trend carries over from Mesopotamia into Egypt through trade networks. And the Egyptians stick with that style for a few thousand years. Do they know how to make things look realistic? Yes. They choose not to. In fact, we'll learn later on that Egyptians were very mathematical about how they did things. They actually had proportional measurements for every single figure and little diagram boxes that certain parts were supposed to fit in. So there wasn't as much individuality happening at all as they were just following that system. And we'll see some examples of that towards the end of this section. How do we know so much about the Egyptians? Well, it's because they left us a whole lot of stuff, particularly in tombs. A whole lot of stuff in tombs. That is because they cared so much about the afterlife that they buried their dead with anything and everything they might possibly need, want, or desire when they died. Which is a good thing for us. It's one of the most abundant amount of materials and artifacts that we have from a culture, aside from places like Pompeii, that was literally buried. So we are lucky on that front. Of course, some tombs were raided. A lot of tombs were raided and things were stolen out of them, but some of the tombs were untouched. A lot of the grave robbers didn't mess with the hieroglyphs or the reliefs. There was no value in them. So we do have a lot of that as far as a record. Now, when you think of a tomb for Egypt, you probably think pyramid, but it didn't start off as a pyramid. The tombs for the dead started off as mastabas. They were flat, like that. Eventually, they evolved into your pyramid that you're used to seeing. Mastabas are rectangular tombs that had a chapel and offering table for the family to visit and bring food to, and then down below, underground, would be where the person was actually buried. Oftentimes, next to the burial chamber, they would have blockage to try and prevent theft. Did it work all the times? No. There'd also be a long shaft to try and deter thieves. But inside of that chapel, they frequently included a statue of Ka. Ka is important for the Egyptians. Ka is spirit. So when people die, even with mummification, your body can deteriorate. Something could happen to it. So what the Egyptians did to make sure that the person, when they died, would still have a body in their afterlife is they would make a statue for their Ka to be housed in, or their spirit to be housed in. So a good chunk of the statues that we're going to be looking at in this section were meant to be used as spiritual houses for them after they died. These statues are a little bit more durable than bodies. Tend to last a little bit longer. Now, like I said, mastabas will evolve. Do they evolve directly into the pyramid? No. They evolve into a step pyramid, which is basically just mastabas stacked on top of mastabas. That is created by the architect Imhotep. He is the first architect that we know by name in art history. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. Imhotep is such a famous and well-regarded architect in Egyptian history that he ends up becoming a god himself in their mythology. That's just a little side note since you're talking about the name Imhotep. So he's a pretty important guy for the Egyptians. He creates a mathematical system of stacking stones to create large burial chambers to house the Ka as well as underground the bodies. Of course, as you see, it just descends in size as you go up. The Egyptians did use stones for these, unlike the Mesopotamians who used mud bricks. So these are a little bit more well preserved than those were. And now you can kind of see from here where the actual pyramid is going to evolve from. So it wasn't a direct evolution to the flat-sided pyramid. This is Dozier's pyramid. It is 200 feet tall. It is not nearly the tallest pyramid in Egypt, though. I'm sure you guys know that. The purpose for large, ostentatious pyramids like Dozier's here was to show off power. We've talked about other people that are interested in showing off power. We will be talking about more people that are interested in showing off power. A lot of grand art and architecture is made just to show off your status in society, which is exactly what this pyramid's purpose is, as well as other architectural features that were created by the pharaohs. Most of the architecture that we're looking at in Egyptian art history, this particular section, was art commissioned by the pharaohs to just show off their power to their country. Why would you want your citizens to revere you as powerful? Why is that important?
So
they respect you and worship you, yeah. To make sure you had that kind of authority over them. I had a hair in my eye. And it's not a regular hair, so it's not going to come out easy. Pepper. So near Dozier's pyramid, as well as most of the pyramids, I'm going to kind of like sketch this out because it's kind of weird to think about it because you don't see it in pictures. So we have a pyramid. Ooh, very sad pyramid. Normally, there would be a walkway or a causeway leading up to the pyramid, and in front or in one of the sides of the pyramid, there would be a temple. The temple would be areas for pharaohs, for citizens to come and offer prayers, for priests to come and pray for their souls and things like that. The body itself would be underground. So So that's kind of how traditional pyramid complexes work, as well as the other pyramid complexes that we're going to talk about. That's exactly how Dozier's worked as well. So this is a part of one of the walls of his mortuary precinct, which was his temple where people would pray and offer up things for him. And you'll notice something interesting about this wall. What's on it? Columns. I mean, they aren't real columns. They're not supporting anything. They're there for decoration.
Are they?
They're not in the round. No, they're stuck into the wall. So it's not even really a column. It's a high relief. But we have seen yet another culture that has used columns, and they aren't Greek. But how are these different from the Persian columns that we just looked at?
They're not.
They aren't detailed.
The capitals are a lot less.
The capitals on these are lotuses, yes. So it's a lot less going on. Lotus, a traditional flower in Egypt. They aren't actual pillars, no.
That's
There's
just
no
a-
fluting going on. There's no base.
That was just a showcasing.
Yeah, this is just showcasing our architectural details.
And how much money they have.
Yes. So a column that is into a wall, just a little side note, is called an engaged column. In case you were wondering what that specific term was. You'll notice as we go through architecture that there's a word for everything. Just wait until we get to Rome. Too many words. Now that takes us to the actual pyramid that we're used to. So our flat-sided pyramids are developed during the Old Kingdom. Of course, mastabas and step pyramids also exist during the Old Kingdom. But this is really where pyramids evolved to. Egyptians won't always stick to the pyramid format. Eventually, they will move past that and start making temple complexes instead. We'll see that more towards the New Kingdom side. But in the Old Kingdom, they did use traditional pyramids. In the foreground, you can see 3-step pyramids. Those were for wives. And in the background, you see the Great Pyramids, which are your flat-sided pyramids. The Old Kingdom period, in case you're caring about dates, because I know some people do, sometimes I do too, lasts from the 4th to the 8th dynasties. If you're wanting to know dates, they are down below. So all 3 of these pharaohs were during the 4th dynasty, which is where the Old Kingdom starts. And if you keep track of dates, you'll figure out when it ends. But we are talking about around 2490 BCE to 2528 BCE for all 3 of these being made. These are, of course, well, one of them, the one in the center, is the Great Pyramid of Giza, another one of the world wonders. Now we've got 2 world wonders checked off. As we continue on throughout our class, we'll get a bunch more. Yay! Unfortunately, the Great Pyramid of Giza is like the only one that's still around. It's also the oldest. It was the first built, and it is the one that is still here. That just is a testament to the architectural skill that was put into coming up with the designs for this. So to make these pyramids, you did have to amass a large amount of wealth and be able to control a large workforce. Which I think if you're familiar with Egypt, you know that they are capable of having a large workforce because Egypt's pretty well known for their architectural accomplishments, including this one. We're going to take a closer look at the Great Pyramid in a second. I think Brandon's already seen this, but he can rewatch it. It won't kill you. The 3 largest pyramids of Giza, which are these guys, were built within a span of 75 years, all 3 of them. And they are for Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure. Khafre is the largest one, or no, sorry, it's Khufu. Khufu's is the largest one, and it is built facing east, which is the rising sun. Once again, sun plays a role in Egyptian art, architecture, and mythology. It is his way of honoring Ra, as well as showing that he is a pharaoh selected by Ra to rule the lands. Inside of Khufu's Great Pyramid contains a mortuary temple, a causeway, valley temple, and the pyramid itself. So as stated, it's not just the pyramid that these pharaohs have. They had multiple buildings outside of it for people to use to honor them. Because people couldn't actually, I mean, they did, but you weren't supposed to go inside the pyramid. Pyramids were built using limestone. The limestone would have been dressed away from the pyramid. Stone dressing is where you're actually shaping the stone. So all of these stones would have been chiseled away from the pyramid and then taken to the location to be installed. There's a lot of theories as to how the pyramids were built. We'll look at some of those in a second with the video. But of course, it takes, like I said, a large labor force, a lot of chisels. Chisels frequently broke before you could even finish one stone. A lot of manpower. Pulleys, rollers, and other tools were used to make these things. And when the Great Pyramid was first made, before it ended up being buried under some sand, it was 480 feet tall. Its temple complex in total covered 13 acres, and it uses 2.3 million blocks.
Wow.
Some of the blocks at the very bottom weigh 15 tons.
Mm-hmm.
Sounds like it would be a lot of fun.
Like I said, Brandon, you've seen this. I'm pretty sure you have. I'm pretty positive you have. But the others have. Yeah, you've seen this one. I showed it last time. Because I just found it.
Look at it and think, what is it? Talk to me, do something like that. I don't understand it. It's sort of really weird.
British archaeologist John Romer first saw the Great Pyramid 40 years ago. Ever since, like so many others, he's been trying to figure out how it was built.
You know, there's an old Arab saying, man fears time, time fears him.
So just standing there, you can see how big these stones are in comparison. And this is the short end, not the long side.
Pyramids, it's the oldest thing in the world. It just stands there.
They're impressive today, but imagine the pyramids in ancient times. Completely white, shimmering in the desert. Visitors to this.
They were covered in a white limestone over top. You can see bits of it still at the top of the Great Pyramid. It's a bit yellowed now, but it was glistening white.
Land must have just looked and wondered, and they probably asked the same question we ask today. How did they do it? In this land of pyramids, the Great Pyramid is pure perfection. It's not just a huge pile of rocks neatly placed on top of each other.
Yeah, so everyone talks about the great precision of this pyramid, but looking at it, it looks a bit rough, actually.
Too bloody precise, doesn't it?
Made well before mathematics was recognised, 2,000 years before Pythagoras came up with his triangle theorem, its perfect angles and joins make this the most precise and most confounding building in the world. You just need to know where to look.
So you get this angle, so this makes this, and you get the angle of the pyramid.
Yes, exactly. That's right. Now, this angle has to be so precise because if you're a wee fraction of a degree out where it takes off from the bottom, you're going to be yards out up in the air up there.
What is mind-boggling about the Great Pyramid is that it's a really complex building designed with some very simple tools, the naked eye and a piece of string. For much of it, they used a plumb bob. a string with a weight on the end, and they lined it up to the stars to create one of the most accurate buildings of all time. 45 centuries later, it is still more precise than many modern skyscrapers. Obviously, the precision was no accident, but how the ancient builders got it so right without modern equipment, no one's worked out until now.
So what are we looking at here?
Well, this is one of the 4 survey points that are absolutely key to understanding how this pyramid was made.
People have been tripping over these survey marks for centuries, but extraordinarily, John Roman is the first to see their significance, to crack one of the pyramid's startling secrets.
That's the 3rd one. That's the 3rd in the line.
Yep.
This one here is really exciting.
He's discovered a one-to-one plan of the pyramid mapped out on the Giza Plateau, right next to the Great Pyramid.
The plan of the pyramid is the pyramid itself. Because if you really want to keep something that accurate, the way to do it is to make your plan at the same size as the finished thing.
By measuring out the life-size plan with string, the Egyptians were able to get their ancient calculations, cubits, perfect.
Now this is the clincher, and whatever anybody says about what I'm telling you here, they say, oh, that's all rubbish, they never did this, but what nobody's ever going to be getting away from is if you measure 40 cubits from that point out there, you get exactly the angle of the pyramids, not vaguely, not nearly, but 51 degrees 50 minutes.
So what does that tell you? What are we standing on here?
We are standing on a sort of design lab. This is where they control the architecture of the pyramid.
But John's discovery doesn't stop there. He believes he's found yet another plan, one for the inside of the pyramid, similar to the exterior but slightly offset. The difference between the 2 grids giving the pyramid its magical angles.
Why haven't these 2 plans been discovered before now?
People were looking for a single design. And what I found was there was no single design, there were 2. You know, 2 designs just slightly disjuncted one from the other, rather like a double helix. And that, I think, put earlier people off, because what they imagined was there must be a single plan.
It's called Mahmoud's Hole. You go in.
And if you keep watching this later on, he takes you inside the pyramid, into the burial chambers and different areas. And you can see a lot of the markings that the Egyptian builders left for them to match things up on it in order to align everything to make that. So cool video. You saw that second part. You didn't see this first part. I didn't show it to them because it's a bit of a longer video. And here's another one that you can check out later on. It's a 360 inside of the pyramid that you can play. It's interactive. I can't play it on here because it doesn't work in widescreen, but you can play it later on when I post it. Most of the old kingdom pyramids are located around Giza. Some of the later ones are not. But this just gives you a rough idea of how things are lined out. So the Valley Temple of Menkaure is pretty far out from the actual pyramid of Menkaure. The pyramid of Queens, or those step pyramids that were in front. It looks a lot closer in picture, like in real life picture, than it does on an aerial viewpoint map. So that just gives you an idea of how big that area is. The Temple of the Sphinx is pretty far out in front of the pyramid of Khafre. The Sphinx was made for Khafre. It goes into his funerary temple and sits in front of his actual pyramid when you're looking at it. And then Khufu's pyramid, the largest one, is back here. Speaking of the Sphinx, which is, I believe, the last thing we're talking about today. Yes. Tomorrow we'll pick back up with mummification. But speaking of the Sphinx is a creature that pops up in art history repeatedly. It's just a human-headed figure with a lion's body. We'll see it again in Aegean art, as well as early Greek art. So it does pop up a few times. It is a colossal statue. A colossal statue is just a fancy word for a really, really big statue. And it is the largest colossal statue that exists in the ancient world. Most likely, this would have originally had a cobra sticking out, which was the traditional headdress for a pharaoh. Cobras on a lot of the statues that we're going to look at later on have also broken off, but they would have been there originally. He also obviously would have had a nose too, and a beard symbolizing his pharaoh. Even the female pharaohs wore a fake beard. It's pretty common, just it was the symbol of being a pharaoh. This creature itself, the Sphinx, was associated as being strong and powerful as well as mythological. They were known as being intelligent creatures and possessing authority given to them by the sun god Ra. So, another example of a pharaoh trying to exercise his authority and power to the people, even after death, although this was built while he was still alive. So thus far with Egypt, we've learned a few things about what they're interested in. Anyone want to recap? What are the Egyptians interested in?
I mean, afterlife,
Afterlife, yes. Death, yes.
Shows of power.
Shows of power is a big one, yeah. Respect, yes.
I mean, there's the mathematical
Yes.
sophistication.
Yes. They are much more mathematically sophisticated than the last people group that we've talked about. Just a little bit. Probably more mathematically sophisticated than the next people group that we're going to talk about as well. We're not going to see architectural ingenuity like this again until the Romans, when we get to them. So it's going to be a hot minute. Like I said, tomorrow we are going to pick up with a continuation of the theme of death and the afterlife with mummies. And that is a mummified cat, yeah. They buried their cats and dogs with them a lot of times. That's the shit. Although I feel sorry for the pet.
Yeah.
But yes, we'll pick back up there tomorrow, and we will speed through Egypt into the Aegeans, which are the precursor to the Greeks, in case you were interested about them and what exactly they were. If you have any questions about your quiz or you're worried about it, let me know, and I can help you feel more comfortable. I assure you. And if you have any questions in general, just let me know, and I will gladly help out. Please go away. I will